Nina, thank you very much. We're going to cross to Tel Aviv very shortly. The polls have closed in Israel, as we've been reporting. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, tweeted this morning, against all odds, a great victory for the Likud, a major victory for the people of Israel. We're going to cross to Tel Aviv shortly for the latest. It seems like a very, very premature declaration of victory, but as I say, that's from the Israeli Prime Minister in just the last half hour or so. In the meantime, though, let's go to our regular panel here this morning here in Canberra. Labor frontbencher Ed Husic and the Assistant Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. Gentlemen, good morning to you both. Let's start with the higher education reforms, Josh, if I can. The government pushing ahead with this, despite no sign that the Senate crossbench is willing to compromise. Do you like defeat?
Look, I think we lost that vote, but we'll win the war. Kieran, I think this is a vitally important reform for Australia's higher education sector, indeed for Australia as a whole, because tertiary education is just so important to Australia's productivity and our future as a nation. I think that the university sector has pretty much been unanimous in supporting these reforms. They recognise that they need increased funding to stay apace with what's happening in the region. We've also made provisions for people from lower socio-economic backgrounds to get increased support to enable them to attend university.
It's all compelling, but you're not convincing the people you need to convince.
We're just a few votes short, and I think Christopher Pyne has been indefatigable in this and will continue to be so.
But again, I put it to you that, well, if we look at what Christopher Pyne said in January, let's go back to what he said in January. He says, if the crossbenchers are not up to microeconomic reform because they don't want to be unpopular with any organisation in Australia or any particular individual, well, the government will accept the decision of the Senate. This does not sound like you're accepting the decision of the Senate.
Well, we believe this is vitally important, and hard reform is also always sometimes hard politics. And so this is hard politics, and we just have to continue to make the case, both publicly and within this building, to the crossbenchers, because we need to pass it through the Senate. We won't let up.
Before I get Ed Husic's comments this morning, I want to play for our viewers some comments that the Prime Minister made this morning. He was on 2SM Radio in Sydney.
We will have another go at this because just about all the Vice-Chancellors say that if our universities are to flourish in the years ahead, they need to lose the dead hand of Canberra. So we will have another go here.
The Prime Minister on 2SM this morning. Now, Ed Husic, the government says that this is a pivotal reform. They're supported by most of the higher education sector, and I guess as someone who watches as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Shadow Treasurer, you know the numbers pretty well. The numbers don't stack up. There's not enough money in the higher education sector for the number of individuals heading in there to study.
Well, we've been concerned that the way that the government has managed the reform process has been that they want to see a system where all the costs get forced on to people higher, in terms of having $100,000, costs or fees for university. In my neck of the woods, that would decimate the ambitions of people that want to go on to higher education, because their parents. Why should it be on the basis of their parents' ability or their own students' ability to pay?
Where did that number come from, though? Has Labor just plucked it out of the air? Because the government is now putting forward a measure which would have safeguards in it that would penalise universities.
We were looking at the way in which the courses are structured at the moment, and looked at the application on various universities around the country in terms of what might happen with medical and law degrees, and you can see that the costs ramp up. People get that the costs will go up dramatically, and they're not willing to stomach a system that would see that. And completion rates are falling. So what was the government's solution to that? Make it even harder for people to actually go in the first place. That is not a system that will build skills in this country in the longer term, when we recognise we do need to lift the amount of people that go through tertiary and vocational education.
So Labor's not budging, the Greens won't budge, Lambie and Xenophon say no way, and it seems a similar sentiment from the likes of Lazarus and Muir. I just don't see how you're going to get there.
But Kieran, what's incomprehensible about Labor's position is when they were in government, they cut $6 billion out of higher education. They know that the budget is getting tighter, so they know there is not that wallet to fund the university. So why why not free them to charge the fees that they need to stay competitive? Now, it's not just us who are saying it. It's also Labor icons like Peter Beattie and Gareth Evans and John Dawkins and Maxine McHugh, all who've come out publicly for these reforms. And yesterday in the Parliament, Christopher Pyne actually named a university which has gone public saying it won't lead to an increase in fees at their university. This could happen in many others.
Do you accept it's not a good look, though, that the minister says he's a fixer and he's fixed it when he's done nothing of the sort?
You know what he did fix? He fixed the fact that Labor did not fund important research in this country in the forward years, and he has now put up money to help fund that going forward.
I mean, it's just been comical seeing the way that Chris Pyne has put a threat on the table, and then by removing the threat, claiming that he's fixed it. And the other point that I'd make too is that, and I've been upfront about this as others have, we had to make some unpalatable choices in terms of making cuts to higher ed so we could funnel it into the Gonski reforms. This is what we had been trying to do to ensure that the quality of primary and secondary education would be lifted. These guys want to be able to cut for the sake of it and not actually dedicate it to the education process. And I'm sorry, Josh, but people from Western Sydney should not have to go, well, do we go to university, can we afford to or not, and then say, well, we can't. We can't be shouldered with that debt. We can't go on and do the other things that we want to do with our lives in terms of having deposits for homes and the like. Why should the people of Western Sydney have less
if you look
chance
at what some of the Vice-Chancellors are saying, Ed Husic and Glenn Davis from Melbourne University argues that if you look at the two areas that are essentially deregulated now in terms of the university sector, postgraduate and foreign students, that we haven't seen a blowout in prices. So why in operation, when we see it actually in the higher education sector for foreign students and postgrad, no blowout, you think there will be a blowout?
Okay. If you look at it in context, Kieran, what has been the standout characteristic of this debate has been threat put on the table to compel, threat as A to compel outcome B. In this case, coming to your question, the threat was, we can cut funding, university funding, but we'll give you the option to deregulate. So threat put on the table. Of course, universities backed the notion of deregulation because they were facing massive funding cuts. They had no other place to go. Now, the government has tried to decouple that, and you can see in the Senate they're saying, having lost their first bill, they'll put the other dereg bill up as well. No one's buying this. They haven't been able to convince the Senate, and in particular the crossbenchers, on the validity of their policy.
Let's go to the budget then, because I guess this was initially valued at $4 billion, I think, from memory, in the budget for over 4 years, and then it was whittled down as Mr. Pyne compromised and tried to get this deal done in the face of intransigence from the crossbench. But what's happening with the budget message? Because the Prime Minister says, he tells the party room yesterday it'll be in balance within 5 years, and yet this budget's not going to hurt people's hip pockets. Which is it?
Well, let's look at the IGR, which gives us the context for our whole budget, which gives us the context, Ed, for our budget narrative and budget attempt. What is happening in the IGR is that we were bequeathed a fiscal nightmare. So debt and deficit was heading up to 122% of GDP. We, as a result of our legislative measures, have now halved that projected debt over the next 40 years.
And to balance it, you need to pass the budget measures, which you're not doing.
Right, so 80% of our budget measures have actually gone through.
Yeah, but 30 remain, and that's 20 billion in revenue.
And as you know, we've said that around $30 billion is stuck in the Senate, opposed by the Labor Party, including around $5 billion worth of savings that they took to the last election.
So where do you find that from? It's not getting through.
Well, a lot of these we're continuing to prosecute, as Scott Morrison is doing in his space, and Christopher Pyne will do in his space and elsewhere. The point is, we have to continue with the path of fiscal consolidation. We have to reduce our spending over time, because that was the legacy that we left.
I understand
At the same time, you will not see the cuts in this budget that we saw.
But how do you make that work? Because I understand the point you're making. But how can the Prime Minister balance it on the one hand, the budget, within 5 years, and still make the reductions commensurate with the budget reductions and not hurt people's hip pockets
the reality
or
is
make tough
we've
calls.
been a lot more successful than some people give us credit for in getting budget measures through the Senate. Like some 80% of our measures have gone through the Senate. Now, we are saying we did so much of the heavy lifting in last year's budget. It doesn't need to be replicated in this budget. But, you know, Kieran, we would be, avoiding our responsibility to the Australian people if we didn't continue with the path of spending restraint. At the same time, we're always looking to grow the economy, maintain consumer confidence and ensure that we have the sort of policies to go forward.
Part of this government's problem is contradiction on so many levels. There's a contradictory message.
Why is that contradictory?
Well, I'll give you the answer. Just wait. Here's one I made earlier.
Okay.
Josh mentioned the IGR, which is actually refreshing because the government doesn't talk about it. Joe Hockey said that when people hear about... Well, Joe Hockey was saying that when people hear about the IGR, they'll fall off their seat. Well, what happened is the IGR fell into a pond, it's sunk, and no one's talking about it, other than Juggernaut Josh. Josh is the only one who's actually been pushing the IGR. Really?
Yeah.
And then, so here's the contradiction. We're talking about people having retirement savings. We're worried about Australia getting older, which we've known about for generations. Like, you can tell every generation's living older. So how do you sustain them into the older years? And then what happens? You know, we're talking about the sustainability of retirement incomes, and Joe Hockey goes out floating this notion that we'll pay for housing through super. There's contradiction. There's contradiction in the one hand of them saying, oh, the budget's being held up, and then you say, but we got 80% through. You know, you can't, from day to day, the message actually changes, and there's no constancy of theme to try and bring the public along, which, you know, this is the problem.
Okay.
Their political management skills are shot.
Gents, just pause it for a tick. I've got our reporter, Oren Lieberman from CNN. He's joining me live from Tel Aviv. He's at the Zionist Union function there in the wake of their polls closing. Oren, thanks for your time. The polls have closed. Netanyahu very confident.
The number is too close to call.